Good morning, everybody. How are you this morning? Is everyone all right? Had a nice Saturday? Perfect. My name is Peter Eszenyi, and I'm a visual effects supervisor and creative director. And what I would like to talk about today is how me, with the help of my team, created the prologue for the new Netflix Dark Crystal series. A couple of questions that I have to ask up front. How many of you had seen the original film? There's a couple, that's good. And how many of you had seen the new series? That's good, all right. So we have something like a common ground. Before we get into the details, let me show you a few of the films I'd worked on, and quite a lot of them are sci-fi and very technical, so that's another interesting little challenge. That was another interesting little challenge for me to do something so completely different that it takes me out of my comfort zone. Let me show you a little montage of what I do usually. So, let's talk about the original film. The original Dark Crystal film came out in 1982, which is about 37 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. I have to tell you that I did not really see the original when it came out. And when I watched it much later, it was really sort of like a very unique and very intense and powerful world full of darkness and full of characters that made everybody who watched the original, or a lot of people who watched the original, quite scared. But one thing was absolutely sure, that it was a fantastically detailed and brilliant world with a great story, a lot of mystique and all sorts of stuff that can sort of like promise a larger world than the film actually itself. So for a couple of years there was some attempts to make a sequel or a prequel or an animated version. But nothing really happened up until Netflix started to get involved with this project. So Netflix started to work with the Hanson company, and they decided quite early on that they want to do a film that's true to the original. So it's not CG, the characters are not going to be CG. They're going to use technology as much as it's possible to extend the world as it existed, build up sets a little bit higher than they were on set. And this was a huge task for everybody involved. Close to 250,000 people worked on it. They created almost 200 puppets. If you've seen the new one, the voice actors are absolutely superbly famous ones, like Mark Hamill. So it was a great sort of like thing to be part of. And you might ask, how did I get involved? Well, when they started to edit the series, they recognized that there's need for a prologue, which sums up where this world is at the moment, who are these characters, what they do, what's their motivation. And some of these shots were already in the series, but there were quite a few shots that were missing from this prologue, which were narratively superbly important. And one of the producers who I work with called me up and asked me whether I really want to get involved in this. And then partially I started to panic a little bit because I did not know too much about Dark Crystal. So I immersed myself in this world and started to learn more about what's going to happen. So the prologue in itself, that was about, I would say, 4 or 5 pages of script. And some of the challenges were sort of like contained in a two-line sentence, which is, for example, in the case of the opening shot, the camera travels through space, which is full of Brian Froud's brilliant symbols. And that sounds like an easy task to do, but let me tell you, it wasn't. So who's this guy? Brian Froud, he's a British illustrator and designer and production designer. And he's the one who designed basically, quite a lot of the iconic dark crystal imagery. His style is quite unique, as you say. As you see, it's very much hand-drawn. It's very analog. It's not digital at all. So one of the first challenges that I faced was to take this iconic imagery and do something with it that could be used in a pipeline, that could be sort of like used in animations without resorting back to scanning this old images in and just use them as textures. So what I started to do in the beginning is I had a library of these symbols. Some of them I gathered myself, some of them came from the art department. So I went to Illustrator and redid quite a lot of these drawings. So cleaned up the lines, kept everything that was necessary to have the same sort of idea, but made them a little bit more precise here and there. And then I started to create these style frames to understand how this opening sequence is going to look like. So from Illustrator, I exported the curves into Cinema 4D, where I rendered the sequences, or in the case of style frames, just still images. And I brought them into After Effects, which is how I like to do kind of like look dev work and sort of like style framing and concepts, because I just love the power that it gives to me when you can layer up as many things as you want, and you use one layer as a mask and the other layer as a layer that just deals with colors and all sorts of stuff like that. So this is just a quick overview of that process that I mentioned. As you see, this is an After Effects project. I brought in some space backgrounds. I brought in the renders that I did in Cinema 4D. And I brought in beautiful colorful images that I used as layers to drive the texture and the color. And what's really powerful is that if I do something like this, and I send it to the director, and the director says that I like the idea, but I think I would like to see another color variation. It literally takes 2 seconds for me to do something like that, and then I can send it over, and we get to the point when we are on the same page much, much easier and faster than it was before. As you see, this is a totally non-destructive process, so I can always go back to where I was before if that's what we agree on. So this is pretty much how I do the style frames. And then when we have them ready, just playing with colors and all sorts of stuff like that, that's when I finish the animation. That's when I do the animation. This is straight from Cinema 4D. This is how it was laid out. And it was quite a big challenge because some of these symbols are very unique. Some of these, almost like alchemy-like things are very unique. But they don't look really good if they are in the distance. Or if they are really, really close, then you don't understand what they are. So that was a bit of a balancing challenge there, how to animate them to make sure when the camera passes them by, the viewers understand what these do. Lots of little symbols were peppered in this universe. They are part of the Skeksis alphabet, if you really want to figure out all the details. And when we did this, the finishing process was very similar to how I did the style frames. Render out all the elements, bring them into After Effects, play with colors, and render the final sequence. Another big part of this Prologue challenge was the map of Thra. Thra is the planet where the Dark Crystal plays on, and in the original film, there was a partial map of this world, but the visual effects supervisor and the production designer created a map that covered the entire planet, the entire continent, if you will, and they mapped out where each Gelfling clan lived, where was the Skeksis castle. But the big challenge was how do we incorporate this into a story? We did not want to show a flat map. We did not want to do the usual kind of like here's a parchment paper map, and let's put a camera on top of it. So we decided to create a three-dimensional version of the map. And these are, again, some of the style frames that I created through that process. So we created a 3D model of this map, hand sculpted it, added details where it was necessary, kept all the important geological features like the Clone Mountains up in the top left. And then we started to play with textures. And for me, this was one of the most challenging part of this story, because we did not know how this should look like. Should it be made out of clay? Should it be made out of copper? Should it be made out of marble? And I think at the end, when we iterated through all these versions, we decided to do something that's a mixture of everything. And the reason why it was like that is we started to think of this as a sculpture that a Gelfling artist or someone with a bit of artistic skill in the world of Dark Crystal could have created. So, took different materials, forged them together. And I think, as you see, again, we played the ideas. Do we want to have those lines in there which were in the original map, or do we want to get rid of them, or do we want to do something very sort of like organic and not really precise? And at the end of the day, we decided to use certain materials. We wanted to use copper, we wanted to use marble, and we wanted to use wood. So the way we did this is we gathered references for these materials, sent it to the director for sign-off. And as we were doing this process, we were refining the model itself, playing with lighting variations, creating super high-res versions of the map to be used in close-ups. And this is what we got to. This is the final asset that we used for some of the shots, map of Thra. I worked with a brilliant artist called Roland Lucacci on this one. He took my original model, which was fairly low res, and up-resed it, and painted all the textures in Substance Painter, which is something that I really would like to talk about. But before that, let me show you another very important part of this whole prologue, which was the conflict between Ogre and the Skeksis. And how do we visualize something like that, which is a superbly complex kind of like relationship? Who are these guys? How do they come into this world? Who's Ogre? What's they already doing in this equation? And you literally read the script, and it had, again, 3 lines. But we need to flesh this out a bit. So we wanted to use a very complex camera move that shows the relationship between these players, the relationship between them and the Ori. And we wanted to use color and shape and form and materials to sort of like give a bit of emotion to this relationship. And as I said before, I took some models from the art department and started to texture them roughly and started to play with the lighting. Started to play with colors, started to play with ideas like, do we want to have some particle magic in the middle that, sort of like shows that Ogre is being mesmerized by the Skeksis? Or do we want to keep it very minimal? Do we want to keep it more like a shadow puppetry thing, which refers to the concept of the series somehow? Or do we want to get really, really magical? I think close to 60 versions of this was done. Different lighting scenarios. We started to incorporate the model into the actual terrain to make sure that we don't see these as little chess pieces on a board. And I think when we found something that we all liked, that's when we really moved into the details. So these renders are look-dev renders from the prologue. We got these lovely models, the top 2, Ogre and the Emperor, and the other Skeksis from Weta Workshop in New Zealand. They were incredibly high-res models, so we needed to reduce them and create UV maps. And then we started the texturing process, which is something that I'm going to talk about in a minute. That model, the already comes from double negative. We redid the shaders to implicate that this is a newer version of the thing that they used in the series. And the Gelflings, there was a bit of challenge there because we did not want to make them look like they are puppets. We did not want to make them look too real to avoid all the questions about why they are not moving and what they do. So we got these models from DNAG again. We created a version of it. We reduced the polygons, we remeshed them and reposed them. So we need to rig those models to make sure that they can create a perfect circle. And then we did the textures. And for the texturing, we used Substance Painter. And usually what I do with Substance Painter is I hand paint as much as I can. But in the case like this, when time is paramount, we started from a very different sort of like point. And to illustrate this whole idea, let me show you a little bit of a process video that I did. So this is the model of the Emperor. Those are the UV maps on the right, which are absolutely crap-tastic, if you will. They're absolutely not good. But for purposes of this, I think they were pretty useful. Baked out all the textures. This is a fully reduced version of the original model. So baking it is very, very easy, just one click, and it creates all the maps that you need for the texturing process. And then what I do usually is I create a fill layer and pick a color and start to hand paint. But the problem with hand painting was that, well, partially because I like it, I get really sort of like immersed in it, and it takes 3 hours for me to faff around with little details here and there. But as I might have mentioned earlier, this was a project where time was absolutely super important. We came in quite late into this process. So just to illustrate, this is what I would do if I had time and proper UV maps, just to go in and do a bit of hand painting. But instead of that, what we did is we went back to the procedural part of using Substance Painter, which is you can use Exchange to grab materials, or it comes with quite a lot of built-in things. You can find these online. And for us, the important bit was to be able to iterate through things. So when we got to the idea that the Skeksis need to be metallic, they need to be sort of like somewhat majestic, but kind of like worn down in places to show their age. We started to grab these basic materials and started to layer them up, turn layers off, turn layers on, just to get a basic understanding of what we want to do, how this process is going to, help us. And oxidization, just to show the corruption of the Skeksis, was pretty much a very easy thing to do. And in Substance Painter, the powerful thing is that you keep the procedural bits and you layer up all sorts of manual bits on top of that. So I picked another color, which was fully oxidized or corroded bronze, and started to turn off layers to layer that up with a copper layer. And after that, what I do usually is go in and paint in little details with hand. And with this, and this is actually recorded in real time, so with this, you can really get to a good point literally in no time. And when you have a lot of shots to do, a lot of assets to think about, this is a game changer, because I'm ready to do a render in 5 minutes. And that render is good enough for the director to be able to decide whether he wants to continue down this path of the Skeksis being made out of metal, or do we want to have something more organic? The other big thing is that it has a built-in renderer called iRay, and because it uses HDR lighting, I can get to a point where it pretty much looks like how I want the shot to look like. So I can test my textures and shaders in a real-world environment, and I can make decisions based on this one. So if the lighting is much warmer, if the sun is shining much more brightly, whether this texture is good enough or not. So that was basically how we did the textures on all these models. A very similar process was used to create the Gelfling sigils, which were sort of like modeled from 2D references. They were beautifully hand-drawn sort of like versions of these symbols, and we created 3-dimensional models out of them, textured them in a similar way. And again, it's a little bit too dark. But the idea was to texture them individually, and those textures should match the characteristics of the Gelfling clan. Something that needs to be more related to the sea is some sort of a bluish material, and so on and so forth. But we decided to use some sort of distressed gold kind of thing. A few things about the technical details before I get further. So we used Cinema 4D as the main DCC tool. We rendered most of the shots in Redshift. And as you might have guessed, Substance Painter was the main app for texturing because of it's super powerful, and we really like to use that. We did most of the look dev and most of the comps in After Effects, very similar to the process I showed you earlier. And now we'll get to the super interesting bits. Some of these shots, let's break them down. One of the crucial things on this project was that this is just a small cross-section of the amount of versions that we did. Every shot had at least, I would say, 30 to 50 versions. So this project was going on for 3.5 months. And you can imagine, the time pressure that we had on this one, because we needed to deliver it for the editorial process to match it to the music perfectly. And there were quite a few changes with regards to the camera move, the distance, how we want to get to those sort of like sigils. So speed was absolutely important. This is the breakdown of the comp, our usual comp that we did alongside the process. Nothing super fancy here. It's just renders straight out of Cinema. We rendered all the AOVs, all the sort of like depth maps and normal maps and stuff like that. We brought in the camera for us to be able to layer in some smoke and animated 2D layers scattered in 3D space to create a bit of atmosphere. We used the masks to make this pop a little bit more and change color here and there. A bit of a lens distortion, and that was a version. And this is how the final one looked like. A little bit more layers than this in the final one, but I guess you get the idea. Very similar process on this shot, which was 310. The funny thing about this was that halfway through the process, all of the cameras needed to be sped up. And that was a much more challenging task than I've ever expected. But again, because we had tools at our disposal that we can use and iterate through these very quickly, it really saved us. This is how the final one looks like. Very similar to the previous one. If you don't know, the really powerful concept behind using these render layers is that you can change a lot of things in post or in comp rather than going back to the render. So it saves, again, a lot of time. And this is the big shot. This is the last one where we try to figure out how to introduce Ogra, the Skeksis, what sort of camera move is the one that's working for us. And again, as you see, we had quite a few versions of this one. Now, the challenging bit was that this shot, the last bit of this shot, needed to match the following shot, which was a shot from the series. So we got those camera datas, and we needed to match that into our CG camera, which was a really, really challenging thing to do. And this is how the final breakdown of that shot looks like. This is a little bit more complex. It had lots of particle simulations going on. And it's a much longer shot. It's close to 700 frames, which is almost about 20 seconds without any cuts. Those are the texture skeksis, different variations in color and texture. Lots of atmospherics. A hand-painted Ogra. And the orrery. So, before I show you the final prologue, these are the people and teams I would like to say a quick thank you to. Because Netflix did sort of like manage to do something that I think that's quite extraordinary with the help of the Jim Henson Company, who did their absolute best to bring this world alive again. Louis Leterrier, the director, had a very singular vision, and he did direct an incredible series. The DNEC TV team, who we work with very closely. And one thing that I really have to point out, that if you work in films or television or any of these kind of sort of like projects, it's teamwork. And teamwork sometimes is a word that everyone uses, but not really understand what it means. In this case, it means that if I do something that directly impacts at least 50 other people. So communication and working as a team is extremely important. Sean, the visual effects supervisor, absolutely brilliant to work with him, really helped us through this project, as well as Alex, who was one of the producers who I work with. There was a brilliant editorial and VFX and production team on this project, and these two guys, Roland and Ferdinando, they were my colleagues who created the shots. Ferdy created the space opener, the glyphs, the animations, and Roland created the textures and the models. So let me show you what this whole thing looks like.
Another world, another time, another age. Thra, a wondrous planet circling 3 suns, and at its center, the crystal of truth, the heart of Thra, and the source of all life. Since the land was young, Aughra protected the crystal, for she knew that the crystal connected all the creatures of Thra. But closest to her heart were the Gelfling. 7 clans of Gelfling call Thra home. From the proud Vapra in the mountain city of Harar, the most cultured of the Gelfling, who rule over the 7 clans, to the fierce Stonewood, who dwell in the endless forest, renowned for their prowess in battle, and the gentle Groton, who live deep beneath the ground, in perfect harmony with all of Thra, forgotten by the world above. For uncounted millennia, all of Thra existed in perfect balance. But then, new beings came, not of Thra. The Skeksis. They bewitched Aughra with stories of the universe and built her an orrery so that she might discover the mysteries of the cosmos for herself. And so, Aughra turned her eye to the stars. And entrusted the crystal of truth to the Skeksis.
All right, so that was it. I think I hope you enjoyed it. I definitely did, and thank you very much for watching this. If you want to have any questions, I'll be around here for a little bit, and I'll be back at 3 o'clock, where we have a little discussion about things related to visual effects. So thanks again. Watch the series; it's absolutely brilliant. I saw you being immersed in it immediately. Thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your IBCs.